and welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. I'm joined today by a very special guest and a very good friend, and somebody I'm very proud to call my friend, Victoria Coates. Dr. Coates was the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump, and she went on then to become the Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Energy and his representative to the Middle East and North Africa. Victoria is currently serving as the Distinguished Fellow in Strategic Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. And yes, I was looking away to make sure that I gave her a Gus title, the right word. So anyway, I'm very pleased to have her here. Hey, Victoria, how you doing?
Carolyn, I'm great. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a great privilege, I feel, to have you on my program and to pick your brain for myself and my own erudition, and also for that of the people who are watching. Thousands and thousands of people are going to be racing as soon as they find that you've joined me, because you really are one of the premier analysts of the Middle East and North Africa in the United States, I would say. And I wanted to talk to you this week because there's so much going on, and it all seems rather negative. You have the nuclear talks in Vienna. They dispersed on Friday so that everybody could go back home and get instructions because they're getting to crunch time. And this after Richard Nephew, I think his name is, who was the expert on sanctions, and apparently another member of the American negotiating team, quit because they couldn't stand Robert Malley's genuflection to the Iranians, and they were very concerned about where the negotiations were heading, at least according to the Wall Street Journal report on what happened. In the meantime, you have the U.A.E. that is now being attacked by missiles from the Houthis, who are the Iranians' Yemenite proxies. They had another missile attack, which was apparently intercepted during the visit last night, or we're taping on Monday, of Israeli President Isaac Herzog, who's in Abu Dhabi. I think this is the third missile that the Houthis have shot at Abu Dhabi and the UAE over the past not very long time, week or two, expanding their war from just Saudi Arabia into the UAE, openly as punishment for them joining the Abraham Accords. In the meantime, the UAE and the Saudis are maintaining or expanding their talks with the Iranians. The UAE is Iran's apparently largest trading partner. And then you have Iran and Russia and China all having naval exercises together. So there's a lot going on. None of it seems very good. And where do you think we should look first when we're trying to analyze what's happening in the region? And is there some point, like an Archimedes point, that we can look at and say, if we could just switch things in one direction, then other things might fall along the side or follow on, and things might move in a different direction? How difficult do you think it'll be to reverse the damage that's being caused as well right now?
Well, that's a lot. You're absolutely right. It's hard to find points of light in that picture. I would say you did mention the one that sprang to my mind, which is President Herzog's visit to UAE over the last couple of days. And important to note, it wasn't just a flying visit. He didn't land, see Mohammed bin Zayed and fly out again. He did an extensive slate of meetings. I spoke to the Emirati ambassador to the United States last night to check in after the missile attack, and he said that they had been delighted by the visit, that they were very pleased with the president's visit to the mosque. They were going to the expo in Dubai, I believe, today, and
they said that 600,000 people visited the Israeli exposition in the Dubai Expo, which is pretty.
And this may seem a kind of a funny detail, but one of the things you do at the expo is you're issued an expo passport, which is a souvenir, and you get stamps from all the what do they call them, pavilions that you visit. And the Israeli stamp is one of the most popular stamps. And if you think about a couple of years ago, when we all had multiple diplomatic passports issued because you couldn't have your Saudi visa and the same passport that you used to go to Israel, And now you have people from the Arab world lining up to get Israeli stamps as a souvenir of their visit. That really points to the fundamental change, which is the good news. And the other piece of good news is that the Emirates and the Bahrainis, and to some extent the Saudis and Omanis, have absolutely no interest in backsliding on this. They do not want to see this go away. They want to have the very tangible benefits of the Abraham Accords continue to be made clear to their respective peoples, and I put Morocco in that camp as well. So I think that is to the good. I would hope that the current American administration could just take a policy of benign neglect toward the Abraham Accords, let the private sector engagements percolate along on their own. And if there's a change in the Congress in November, it's possible that you'll see a much more aggressive, forward-leaning posture in the Congress to support the Abraham Accords, to support those relationships, and also to reach out to the Gulf allies who are feeling very, very alone in all of this. And one point I wanted to make about the attacks on UAE, and there have been three. They sort of seem to happen on Mondays for whatever reason. But this Monday is obviously to coincide with President Herzog's visit to express their displeasure about peace and prosperity in the region. But the one last Monday also targeted an installation where there were American servicemen. So make no mistake, I mean, this is basically the Iranians attacking American servicemen and women. And by the grace of God, they were, and by the grace of the Patriot missile batteries that defended them, they were not injured. But we can't assume that's always going to be the case. And meanwhile, you have Rob Malley and his team, as you point out, engaged in these discussions in Vienna, as if there's some kind of good faith discussion that you can have with a regime that's attacking your allies and your own people.
They
And
were
it just
saying
makes no
that
sense.
They were saying that, a couple of things about that. One is that there's a former American, I think, hostage who was hunger striking for 5 days outside of the negotiations in Vienna, demanding freedom for the hostages. And then Rob Malley came out and said, yeah, we can't really see how we'd get a deal without freeing the hostages. And then it came out today that the United States is asking Qatar to unfreeze, I think, $10 billion of Iranian oil revenues in exchange for freeing hostages. So they're just encouraging the taking of more hostages by saying, we'll give you $10 billion if you let the American hostages out. So I find that, just alarming and on so many different levels. But that's Robert Malley's response to, yeah, we definitely need those hostages out. Here's $10 billion. Let's see you get them out. And then you also had, alongside the Abraham Accords, which were very important, you have this Saudi and UAE attempts or moves, as well as Egyptians, to get closer to the Chinese and the Russians, and looking for ways to kind of balance or diminish their dependence on the United States. And I'm wondering whether, although it's the Abraham Accords continue to be very popular in the Arab world, whether the strategic rationale for them, which is an unofficial but very clear anti-Iranian military alliance, whether that's being undermined now because of the sorts of things that Robert Malley is doing, that the Biden administration is doing vis-a-vis Iran and the Houthis.
It's certainly posing a challenge to it. Again, the good news is that nobody wants to choose to get closer to the Iranians. And, if you're given a direct choice between the United States and China, reasonable folks tend to choose the United States, or a little bit nicer. But certainly the security arrangements were one of the great attractions for the Abraham Accords, and the idea of entering particularly into a security relationship with Israel. And that, I think, remains attractive. But, quite frankly, given the fact that the Biden administration repaired none of what I considered to be the fatal flaw of the original JCPOA, I know it's hard to pick one, but in my opinion, not having regional engagement in the deal, except for the Iranians, was a huge problem. And and so if you don't have the people who are directly in the path of what is obviously a military nuclear program for the Iranians, at least at the table, I don't understand how you think there can be regional buy-in for the deal. So, I don't blame anybody for feeling like they, given that the United States is about to make such an enormous strategic security blunder, that they need to figure out what their path is and how they're going to protect themselves. And quite frankly, that could mean talking to the Iranians if you feel that's your last resort. Uh, so I'm not surprised that activity would be going on. It's disappointing, and I know a number of our regional contacts who do talk to the Iranians came to the Biden administration at the beginning of the administration and said, "Do not take any of the pressure off of them. If you want to get to a deal, the way to do it is ratchet up the pressure because the Trump administration has left you with enormous leverage, and they did the opposite."
Right.
You know,
From the outset,
remove
they
yeah.
did the outset from the outset.
So they're not listening to the folks, even the folks they purport to listen to, they're not listening to in the region, and they think they know best. And it's a really impending disaster, in my opinion.
And one of the other aspects, and you were, I think, very supportive of it, and maybe you can talk about it a little bit, is the gas cooperation that Israel developed with the East Mediterranean, gas consortium with Cyprus and with Greece, and even with Egypt. And the concept there was that they were going to bypass Turkey and make a gas pipeline that would include these countries and go directly to Europe, rather than being dependent on Turkey, and that was going to help everybody. And just a couple of days ago, or last week, the Americans informed Israel and Greece and Cyprus that they no longer supported the pipeline, which of course ratchets up significantly Turkey's position vis-a-vis Israel, and undermines the alliance that had been built over time, specifically because of the gas finds between Israel and Greece and Cyprus, who are members of the EU.
Yeah, it's really one of the most disturbing things. Again, it's hard to pin down the most disturbing thing, but this was a real unforced error. One of the moments I can remember very clearly from being in Abu Dhabi in the summer of 2020, when I knew, sort of in my heart, that we were going to get to the Abraham Accords, was when the Chevron deal to purchase Noble Energy in the Eastern Mediterranean was announced. One of the American energy majors going into an Israeli
Which means that
resource.
which effectively meant that the Arab-Israeli conflict was over, right? Because
Right. I mean, even more than the courts themselves, there's no way Chevron endangers its relationship with Saudi and Qatar and UAE over Israel, unless they have ironclad assurances that that's not going to be the case. So, energy was in a way at the heart of where we got with the accords. And I'm basically agnostic on the pipeline. My feeling on the pipeline was when the numbers made sense, the pipeline would be built. Because there's no sense building a pipeline that's so expensive that natural gas, when it gets to Europe, isn't purchased because it's so expensive.
Mhm.
But technology is evolving all the time. So one of the arguments and one of the small victories at the Department of Energy is that they said on an economic basis they did not support the pipeline. I said, how about we say we do not support the pipeline yet? That we want to continue to explore. We have concerns right now, but that we are in theory strongly supportive of this cooperation. And now we've gone through the looking glass where we have a Turkish propaganda video coming out over the last couple of days that has the State Department Special Envoy for Energy, Amos Hochstein, talking about how the State Department won't support any fossil fuel projects anymore, and they won't support the pipeline. So these people are being used in Turkish propaganda. I mean, that's not a good look. And for us, particularly with what is going on with Russia and Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to allow that to go into use, well, saying we won't allow our partners and allies to, move into this very productive, cooperative relationship is in my mind, I mean, akin to madness. And they didn't have to do it. They could just say nothing. But for whatever reason, with everything else that's going on in the world, they decided to spend the calories on getting this announcement out there, which means they care about it.
Well,
So
it's a little bit weird because I mean, one of the things that was in a way positive, you could say, about Joe Biden was that he was anti-Turkish, right? I mean, as vice president, he said some pretty mean things about Erdogan along, because he was becoming so anti-American. And here, I mean, the main beneficiary, or it's not just that the main beneficiary of this thing is Turkey, but it's also that you've seen Turkey, which is now in dire economic straits, is suddenly making a play for the Jewish state, thinking, somehow or another, the Jews who, because he believes that the protocols of the elders of Zion is true, that the Jews are going to somehow or another pull his fat out of the fire that he set, on his economy. And by going against the pipeline deal with Israel and Greece and Cyprus, the Americans are now being very friendly to Turkey. I mean, that's a very friendly thing to do for Turkey, and Israel now is being very almost pushed and pulled again back to Turkey, which I don't think is a very stable place to be, largely because everything bad that happened in Israel's relationship. Israel and Turkey were the closest of allies 20 years ago, but they stopped being almost entirely, if not entirely, because Erdogan is a jihadist and he hates Israel and he hates Jews and he doesn't want to have a strategic relationship with Israel for ideological reasons. So the idea that Israel should go in now and not expect to be booted out again as soon as he doesn't need us, and in a very profound way, while Hamas is operating in Turkey, is pretty alarming. But it seems like this is an outcome that now Joe Biden wants as well.
well, it's curious, and I think Erdogan is increasingly unpopular in the United States, and it's unfortunate because when Turkey is in a stable, productive position, they can be an enormous force for good, given their location, their resources. Nothing would make me happier than to see the Turkish government take a very different posture and go back to being a true friend to the Jewish state. And I think it can happen in the future. I mean, bear in mind, Erdogan is not going to, go on forever. And, they have some political alternatives and they have upcoming elections that are looking to be fairly hotly contested. So let's see, because as you said, what he's done to that economy is nothing short of criminal. And when I was last in Ankara, which would have been October of 2019, you could buy 3 lira for the dollar. It's now around 15. It just can't go on indefinitely, and certainly, I think the Turkish people can and should expect much better than that. But certainly, any policy right now that rescues him, especially given his actions in the Eastern Mediterranean, his attempt to co-opt the transitional Libyan government, all these other things, this really should not be green lighted by an American administration.
Well, what do you think? I mean, you know, Trump had an underlying concept that really, I think, was the basis of his foreign policy. And you could understand it, right? That he wanted to empower America's enemies to defend themselves so that America wouldn't have to keep doing it. That he wanted to disengage.
America's allies.
What?
You said America's enemies.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant allies. Obviously, yes. No, because it does seem that Biden's doing the exact opposite of that I was describing Biden's policies, and that's really what I wanted to speak to. Trump, I mean, if speaking as somebody who lives in Israel, which is America's most stable ally in the Middle East. Israel benefited massively from this very new American policy, which was saying, look, we don't want to be tied down to this region forever, but we're not going to abandon it. What we're going to do is we're going to empower our allies to defend themselves, which is an incredibly important thing to do because, America for many years has built its alliance structure based upon dependence of allies on the United States. And, I can understand the rationale for it, but as a U.S. ally, it's much better to be independent than dependent. And any country should want to be strategically independent rather than dependent, because you don't want to be dependent on the whims or the vicissitudes of another country's national interests. And so for Israel, Trump's foreign policy was amazing and transformative in many ways. But now we're not just back to the old, we want Israel to be dependent on the United States. We're in a very different place. And I'm trying to figure out, do you see a guiding concept that's directing Biden's foreign policy other than just undoing everything that Trump did, the consequences be damned?
No, I mean, that does seem to be the guiding principle.
Yeah.
There seems to be no interest in examining any of our policies or initiatives to see if there might be merit to them. And so, one of the things that you and I have discussed, which I think is a very important initiative that will keep as warm as possible and ready to go in the event we have a new administration in 2024 or 28, would be the Middle East Strategic Alliance concept, which is the GCC plus Jordan and Egypt, and now Israel can openly be part of that discussion and basically impose what was President Trump's views on NATO onto Mesa, where the Middle Eastern countries would fund their own defense. The United States would, participate and provide leadership and organization, but that it really would be a regional defense network that the region would be bought into. Because I'm old enough to remember, to have read all of Don Rumsfeld's papers from NATO from '74 and when he was ambassador, and he was complaining about the Europeans not funding their own defense almost 50 years ago. So that's not new. It was something that was allowed to develop. And, President Trump made great headway in really putting European feet to the fire and saying, if we're going to put our people and our material in your continent to defend you, y'all are going to have to pony up. And so the idea would be to not let that happen in Mesa from the get-go and make sure it is a true alliance and a partnership that the region feels responsible for. So that kind of concept, I think, can continue to be discussed and developed. Again, the Congress can get involved in working on that as well in the meantime, so that if we do have a change, we can be ready to go with it.
Can you explain a little bit what you mean by Congress can do this? If as right now is forecast by just about everybody, although we haven't seen who's counting the votes, but as has been forecast, the Republicans are likely to retake control in a major way of both houses of Congress in November. And if that happens, what exactly could Congress do to try to undo some of the damage? What is it that Congress can do?
It's definitely a challenge, as I know from my experience working for Senator Cruz, both
Right.
in the minority and the majority. You can't. It's very hard to.
Oh, let's just say Victoria also served before she joined the Trump administration. She was Senator Cruz's foreign policy chief.
And it's hard to force an executive branch policy. You can certainly slow a lot of things down. So when you're controlling, because the control that Congress has is the power of the purse.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you can get pretty granular, prohibiting the use of any funds to reopen a consulate to the Palestinians in Jerusalem. But you could appropriate funds to open a consulate to the Palestinians in Ramallah, if you wish to do that. So you can tinker with things that way.
What do you mean? Like if they say we want to open a consulate in Jerusalem, you can say you can have your consulate, but it has to be in Ramallah.
Right. But I mean, you would have one vehicle that would prohibit the use for any consulate in Jerusalem, and you'd have another vehicle that would permit
I see.
the opening of a consulate in Ramallah. Now, because of the security situation, that would largely be symbolic. I don't think the State Department would ever go ahead with it. But you could say, look, we're not stopping you from talking to the Palestinians. You want to talk to Palestinians, go to the mall and talk to the Palestinians. But you're not going to do it in West Jerusalem, which is, as we know, where the former consulate general is. And so, that's the kind of thing you can do. On Mesa, you could do a amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which would then hopefully be funded by the appropriators to, to fund, a headquarters or a series of meetings on the topic. Whether or not the administration would attend would be another question. But by the time we get to this, we would be, well into 2023 in the new Congress, and 2024 is around the corner. So, what the Congress would do in that period would lay down the markers that would hopefully be picked up by any new Republican administration, in January of 2025. And so that's the kind of sort of foundational work. One other thing I did want to mention in this context is there's a bunch of very weedy, boring things that I do not want to get into and put all of your viewers and listeners to sleep, but legislative fixes that the Congress can get into in 2023 that will be enormously helpful to any new administration. And this is everything from the 123 agreements that we do on civil nuclear programs, which dates back to the 50s. The legislation overseeing the use of our strategic petroleum reserve dates back to the 70s. All of this needs to be overhauled and modernized. The Democrats have no interest in any of it, but I think a Republican Congress would want to spend this year or so after these midterms getting that work done, so a new administration could really hit the ground running.
Well, when you think about it, I guess all of us were looking at what the Biden administration is doing vis-a-vis Iran, and really rebuilding America's alliance system or its posture inside of the Middle East, away from its allies and again towards Iran and its terror proxies, which is just, I mean, it's Obama's policy, but 5 years later, after everything that has happened, both in terms of Iran's advances in the nuclear field, and also with everything that happened in terms of the Abraham Accords and the alliances that were built between Israel and the Gulf states in particular, but also North African states. And really, I think that a lot of the damage here is so profound that it would be difficult for future administration to repair. I mean, when you talk about the Republicans only getting up and running if they take over the House and Senate in 2023, the question is, where is Iran's nuclear program going to be by then? They're saying that they're just weeks away from breakout. I mean, they could very well have a couple of nuclear warheads by 2023 at the current rate. So we're looking at a region that could very easily be transformed far before, well before a presidential election, and arguably at least months before the Republican majority in Congress would be able to actually do anything.
Well, that is the hard reality that we face, and elections have consequences, and you could probably make the argument that the most consequential election for the United States was actually the two Georgia Senate seats last January, and losing control of the Senate and all that has entailed. And that we cannot change. And so you're absolutely right. We're looking at a very, very dangerous period. And from my contacts in both the House and the Senate, I know everyone feels that the best use of their time and energy is making sure that these midterms are as much as a success as possible, because we are definitely facing a witch's brew in the Middle East, but that is not the only witch's brew we're facing. And we have Taiwan, and we have North Korea, and we have a very dangerous situation in Ukraine. So all of these are things we need to be as attentive to as possible. But there's literally nothing we can do unless and until the administration recognizes that just complete breakdown that they are overseeing. And you wonder, the line we're given was that the grown-ups were back in charge. These people all have very long government experience. That doesn't seem to have helped them at all in this first year. But I think back to the Carter administration, which had a lot of the same kind of hoopla going in, that finally, after all the disasters of Nixon and Ford, the grown-ups would be back in charge, and they of course made a horrible hash of it. But at the end, they recognized it and they did reverse course. And it took Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution, all of which starts to sound pretty familiar, for that to happen. But it's always possible that some kind of light of reason is going to dawn on these people, and they're going to realize everything we did wasn't necessarily wrong, and everything they're doing is not terrific.
Well, I mean, I guess the question then is, I mean, the Democratic Party in 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and when the Iranian revolutionaries took control of the U.S. embassy and held all the diplomats hostage there, was a very different Democrat Party than it is today. I mean, it really has undergone a very profound radicalization since 2000, um, and so I'm not sure. It's very strange, and in fact, I mean, it seems that Biden is very much a captive of the most radical fringes of the Democrat Party. I mean, Robert Malley worked for Soros in the interregnum, and I said on the Israeli television yesterday, I said, he's a dove that makes the doves blush. He's really off the charts in terms of his pro-Iranian positions, and so I don't know. I mean, I would like to believe that there would be some reckoning.
I
But I mean, do you see that when you look at Tony Blinken, when you look at Jake Sullivan, when you look at the sort of disposition of the senior, and Wendy Sherman, who's a serial uh, uh, you
appeaser.
know appeaser. I mean, she gave North Korea the bomb, and then she went ahead and gave Iran the path to the bomb. I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you really see any potential for these people actually waking up and saying, wait a
My
minute?
hopes are not high. As I said at the beginning, I mean, my biggest hope is for benign neglect to the things I care about. That they could just kind of leave them alone. That might be the thing we would hope most for. One thing I would say though is, I've called what's happening to the Democrat Party, the Corbynization of the
Mhm.
American left. And the good news there is that what Corbyn did to labor in Great Britain was catastrophic.
Right.
When push came to shove, the British people said, "This is disgusting. We're not going to stand for it." And to some extent, that may be what's coming this November, is the beginning of, wow, now we really see who these people are, and we cannot be associated with rampant anti-Semitism, with rampant crime, with all the things that are going a little bit awry here. So it's not a great policy for them, but it's very difficult to live through. While I agree with you, it has captured
Uh,
the power center of the left.
well, I mean, it also takes you to the question, what's happening on the Republican side of the aisle. I mean, there seems to be, I mean, it isn't a question of seeming. There is a significant cleavage inside of the Republican Party. A lot of it has to do with where do you fall on Trump, but it also falls on, where do you, how do you see America's role in the world? I mean, there is an isolationist a tendency that's getting stronger among a lot of people on the Republican base. And I'm not actually certain where I fall on it. If you're going to be going into a country fighting for 20 years and then running away, maybe it is better to just mind your own business, because why would you want to see your country humiliated in that fashion? I mean, there's a real question about that. But how do you see the Republican Party in terms of its, I wouldn't say unanimity of purpose, but sort of sense of shared destiny and willingness to work with one another inside of the Republican Party?
Well, I think I think that we do have some very vocal libertarian leaning both politicians and pundits, notably Senator Paul. But I would add, one of the things, because I talk to a lot of those people. Senator Cruz has a strong libertarian streak. My very close friend Chip Roy is congressman from Texas, also strongly libertarian. But the day Senator Paul uh, objected to the funding for the Iron Dome system, which was held up as the great symbol of this fracture within
Mhm.
the Republican Party, Congressman Roy and I published a op-ed in Newsweek condemning Vice President Harris's sort of infamous incident rather at George Mason University when she basically condoned genocide against the Jewish state. And the fact that Chip wanted to do that, and we didn't time it, it just happened. But I thought that juxtaposition, I mean, he was all in on that project from the get-go. And so even amongst that type of Republican, Senator Paul should really be seen in isolation in his approach to these policies. And certainly there's been no stronger defender of Israel in the Senate than Senator Cruz. Our record on that is something I'm immensely proud of, and he continues that work to this day. It's something he feels intensely passionate about. And so I think it's something to be watched. I think it's particularly a concern among young people, particularly those who are being indoctrinated on our wonderful college campuses. And, that outreach to that age group needs to be made, education, and demonstrating to them, the enormous value of this alliance. But the good news is it's a story that can be told. And I think we just can't take it for granted, though, that absent an active push on the part of folks who do think the U.S. Israel alliance is enormously important, that it's just going to happen. Work needs to be done.
Because I was actually even not talking so much about Israel and the U.S. I was talking about the Republicans' ability to actually lead in a coherent fashion and win. Because
Mhm.
if you have a party that's at war with itself, then it's also going to, it'll also not do very well. Um, Whether it's in power or out of power, because if you can't have a coherent policy, then it's very difficult as a practical matter to do anything useful. But I think one of the other things that I find so troublesome is that there's a roller coaster now. There's a Republican team, and American allies are, or at least threatened American allies are happy, and then you have a Democratic administration and they cancel everything that the Republicans did, and so on and so forth. And so people don't really know who they're talking to anymore. In Israel, um, there's a lot of criticism, I think incredibly wrong criticism of Bibi, of Netanyahu, by the Israeli left, saying, "Look, you made Israel a partisan issue." And I've written extensively on the fact that Netanyahu had nothing to do with that. I mean, he even worked well with Obama, but the point is that Israel became a Republican issue rather than just a national position because the Democrats changed their position on Israel. And so, you can't have you can have a great dinner party with progressives, but you can't expect them to actually do anything useful for you because they hate you. I mean, they really just don't like Israel at all. They don't like America that much either. But I mean, they're not with us, so it doesn't matter if we get along with them because they don't want us to be strong and successful. And so for his American allies, this roller coaster of the rift and the polarization of American politics and foreign policy is really alarming. You know.
Well, it's in a way it's a product of the fallout of the Cold War, because during the Cold War we had bipartisan unison on needing to counter the Soviets. And again, not to be Pollyannish about it, but I do think the clarity of the threat that is being posed by the People's Republic of China is a clarifying moment for the United States in terms of how we are going to orient our foreign policy. And I'll tell you, as we move into these midterms, China is starting to pick up as a campaign issue like I have not seen a foreign policy issue since 9/11.
Really?
And yeah,
How do
and
you explain that? I mean, they didn't blow up, the Capitol building the way that Al Qaeda blew up the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
well, you
So
could argue that what they did is worse. I
you're
mean,
talking about with
everyone's
Wuhan. You're talking about with COVID.
yeah, yeah. That I mean, look what the world's been through in the
Right.
last 2+ years, and the
What
number
we're
of
still
people
going
who have,
through. What we're
and
still going through.
yes, and the number of people who have died, and you know, maybe they did it on purpose, maybe they didn't, maybe it was an accident. I don't actually care. The fact of the matter is they did it and they covered it up and they didn't help clean up the mess once it was exposed. And the as far as I can tell, vast majority of the scientific community was part of the cover up because they were worried about backlash against science, that suddenly everyone would hate science because everyone hated COVID. Well, sorry, if y'all produce this, then you do have some explaining to do. And I think just personally, America, this really resonated from President Trump. The fact that China has basically been taking wild advantage of the United States for at least 20 years, if not 30. I mean, I'd go back to Tiananmen and say that was when they really decided they had us, and because we didn't go after them on that, and it was a deliberate policy of the first Bush administration not to try to exploit Tiananmen as a demonstration of how authoritarian and evil this regime was. They thought they were going to have a repeat of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and unfortunately, that didn't turn out to be the case. But I think the American people realize this is a huge problem, and they wonder, why are our big funds, BlackRock, Bridgewater, pouring money into China and China tech, and thereby exposing the United States to the contagion that comes from that. They really feel this very strongly, and I'm so curious to see what happens with the Olympics, because if this is basically a police state Olympics, uh, that's going to be a real ugly look. And I was very heartened to see the announcement out of Israel yesterday that the Tel Aviv light rail tender was not given to a Chinese company. But I think the United States really needs to make sure we've got plenty of bids in from our companies and our allies' companies, so Israel's not forced into that
Because
decision.
that really is the thing, isn't it? I mean, when you look at how the United States is debasing itself with the Biden administration, embracing the Iranians and really at the expense of all of America's allies in the Middle East, the Arab states and Israel, and American servicemen who are being attacked by Iran's proxies. You see Russia is now taking over. I don't know to say taking over, but becoming a very major arms supplier to Egypt. You have the Saudis and the U.A.E. are also buying platforms from the Chinese. And I mean, I'm sure that if Israel had the opportunity to buy, some nice MiGs and Sukhois from Russia, we probably would be interested in hearing about it. Certainly, if I were defense minister, I'd be interested in hearing about it. Though some of those planes are awesome, but you look at this and you say, well, if America is going to be kicking its allies to the curb, nobody wants nobody in the right mind prefers Russia or China to the United States. But if the United States is going to be betraying its allies, then you're putting U.S. allies in a position where they're terrified of being dependent on Washington.
No, it's that's definitely the case, and what we'll see is if
And
the
China, and
if
just to finish, I
yep.
mean, my thought is that China can
Mhm.
very easily be a beneficiary, and then what? I mean, I think you're
Well, and
absolutely
that's
right, like about China being the biggest threat that the United States faces, and in a way, it's even worse than than the Soviet Union because there's so much more. Uh, there's so much. I don't know what the word is. I had it in my head and then I forgot it. But I mean, they're so underhanded in what they're doing. I mean, they've gone about it so systematically, and Russia was never an economic power, and China is, and they're undermining, as we've seen, U.S. manufacturing. They've gutted the Rust Belt, and with the cooperation by co-opting all of these major American companies and bringing them over there and showering them with cash. And and so America is facing a huge challenge from China, but the Biden administration is telling America's allies, go to Beijing. We're not helping you. You
Well, that's I think their fatal flaw, and as I said, I think this is something the American people recognize pretty clearly. And it's easy to some extent in hindsight to see that it by the 1970s the Soviets were something of a paper tiger. Yeah, that didn't stop them from going into Afghanistan, although it didn't turn out well for them. um, and at after after the Reagan administration and the fall of the wall, we could see behind the curtain literally and see how hollow that was. And I would just point out about the Chinese that they have been extremely successful on this campaign. But they're not 100 feet high, and they have significant problems of their own that are everything from environmental to systemic financial institution problems. And so, there is plenty that the world's largest economy can and still should do. And as much as I dislike pieces of it, the fact that the congressional Democrats felt compelled to put together a 3,000-page bill. It's called the Competes Act. A lot of terrible things in it, but the whole point of the Competes Act is that they want to compete with China. So we might differ on the individual tactics that we would use, but that's a pretty clear demonstration that everybody sees it's a problem and that everybody's getting calls from their constituents asking what we're doing about it. And so, one thing I would really look forward to, if there is a change, is finding the Democrats that really want to make progress on this issue and figuring out what we can do together to counter it the way we had approached the Cold War.
Yeah, I think that, I think you're right. And I think that the only way that you can really do that is from a position of strength, unfortunately, because right now the strength is
It's a,
on the far left.
it's a challenge.
It's a big challenge. Yeah, I'm reading a biography of Senator Vandenberg, and
Interesting.
striking, right? I mean, he was an
Mhm.
interesting fellow, but he was the for those of you who aren't reading a biography of Senator Vandenberg, Vandenberg was one of the most high level isolationists in the U.S. Senate before World War II, and then as the war progressed, he realized that the United States was going to have to be involved with the world after the war. And he worked very closely first with Roosevelt in 44 and 45, and then with Truman, and really building the infrastructure for fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the UN and all the rest of it. And it was interesting when you were saying about the bipartisan consensus about the Soviet Union. It made me think, well, when Truman was putting together his concepts and the institutions for fighting the Cold War in the late 1940s, um, it was the Democrats that were the more hawkish party, and the Republicans were still coming around from the isolationism of the 1930s, which is why Vandenberg was so instrumental in that. But um, as time went on, the nuclear free movement, the anti-nuke movement, that was all of, and of course the yippies and the new left of the 1960s and 70s. I mean, these were all people who were essentially pro-Soviets, and some of them were actually Soviet agents that were trying to undermine the American consensus, and they were on the left. And so it was the people who built the infrastructure, the party that built the infrastructure for fighting the Soviet Union, 30 years later became the party that was undermining that infrastructure. And so So it presaged kind of where the United States is today. But I agree that if you could find a Democratic Vandenberg on China, that would be
Mhm.
an awfully good thing. What we only have about 10 minutes left, and you were also very, you were the senior director for the Middle East before you became the deputy national security advisor, and you were very involved with the Trump administration's policies on the Palestinians, and also with of course Senator Cruz's incredible support for Israel from the Senate. Um, and when you, what would you say about where Biden is right now on the Palestinians? They're saying these crazy things about settler violence when Israelis are being attacked all over the place by Arab Israelis and by Palestinian Arabs, Jerusalem Arabs. We had beautiful. We have wonderful snow storms in Israel. They last for a day. The kids get to go out and play in the snow, build snowmen. My children built an igloo, and go sledding for one day, and then it all melts, which is
We love the
exactly
pictures.
what. Yeah,
We
yeah.
love
The
the pictures.
pictures are great, but then it's over, which is the best picture because you don't have to suffer in. I came from Chicago, where you had two seasons of the year, snow and construction. Getting rid of all the potholes that you got from the snow, which was there for 6 to 8 months. So but the Arabs in Jerusalem used that 24, 48 hours that we had of snow last week to throw rocks covered in snow at Israelis in the old city of Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah,
Mhm.
and at police in Jerusalem, and the administration is attacking settler violence. That the Jews are the ones that are attacking, and it really is very distressing. And where do you think that this is taking the Palestinian conflict with Israel? How do you see this progressing?
Well, it is great personal sadness because it was interesting in the Trump administration, the clarity with which we approached Israel, and the staunch support we had from Senator Cruz and congressional allies, was really, I thought, transformative. And in the early part of the administration, when there was still some, you know, ray of hope that a peace deal would be achieved, and certainly the president was very frank that he wanted to do that. He wanted to get that situation resolved. Uh, you know, and the Palestinians we were talking to, because we also knew, discussions that would eventually become the Abraham Accords were going on, and trying to explain to the Palestinians, this is your moment of maximum leverage. You have something right now that everybody wants, and you can either leverage it to get to whatever is the best deal that you can achieve, or you can squander it. And they squandered it. And that was finally what I think it had UAE and Bahrain just completely fed up, is they just won't listen to this anymore. And there was a remarkable op-ed in, I believe, the Kuwait paper, which I can share with you, and you can share it with your audience, from the last day or so, in which an Arab writer says, the jig is up. This is ridiculous. We should all normalize with Israel because, they are a partner and it is a productive relationship. And I mean, he's not going on, you know, hymns of praise of the Jewish state, but he's like, this is just a practical reality at this point. And so, very disappointing that the administration seems to be trying to stuff the genie back into the bottle. I think, given just I mean, catastrophic failure, it's hard to call it anything else, of the Palestinian Authority, and the even more disastrous failure of Hamas in Gaza. How can you expect anything positive to come out of this? And
Well,
I don't know what.
I don't think that that's what this is about, Victoria. I mean, I would assume you would agree with me. I mean, this is not about trying to get peace. It's about being opposed to Israel. I mean,
Right. No, and that's the thing.
This is pure hostility to Israel, and it comes from Europe, and it comes from the American left, and they want to pursue this policy because they hate Israel. and they don't want Israel around. I mean, they share that with Hamas and with the PLO. And so they do it insidiously and they do it subversively and they do it while saying, oh, we love Israel, just like the Germans do and the French do. And the, that's what the Americans are doing. We tough love, right? But I mean that, and the Arabs, on the other hand, are looking at it as neighbors who are in this region together with the Jewish state and see a lot to gain from having good neighborly relations with them. So that I mean, more and more now, I've seen it for a very long time and I've written about it, but recently, I guess since Biden came in, or maybe since Corbyn, I don't know, but the sense is that this isn't about the Arabs. I mean, the Arab-Israeli conflict is over. It's done. It's done. Like you said, Chevron buying Noble Energy and taking over its gas fields in Israel's coastal waters. That was the end of it. But the Palestinian conflict is getting more important because it's not an Arab conflict. It's a Western conflict with Israel. And that's what's so disturbing about it, in my view.
Well, no, I agree 100%. I think we're sort of coming at the same thing from a different angle. And that's one of the things that's been exposed is, this pursuit of a peace deal with whatever is purporting to be the Palestinian leadership, to get to a peace between Israel and the Arabs. That's just not true anymore.
No.
And but I feel like the Biden folk, because you have John Kerry famously on record saying there can be no peace between the Palestinians or the Israelis and the Arabs until the Palestinian issue. I mean, it's almost like they want to go back and make that true, because they can't bear to be wrong. And instead of
it's
just
not,
taking
you think it's that they can't bear to be wrong, or that they simply don't want to be, that they're not going to allow it to happen. I mean, they were opposed to the Abraham Accords. There was not one Democrat who came to the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem. Not one, not even Senator Schumer, none of them. And then I think none of them came to the Abraham signing accords either. They boycotted this historical peace deal with Israel. And, we mustn't forget the Palestinians, and we're for a two-state solution. And that's what we want to do. And we want to open the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. And by the way, what I understand is that the American official, I don't remember what his name is anymore, is responsible for the Palestinians inside of the embassy, is not subordinate to the ambassador, that he reports directly to the secretary, so that even though he's not a consul general that's independent of the embassy, that he essentially is an independent actor acting under the aegis of the U.S. Embassy.
Yeah, that's going to be an administrative mess. So I think it should be watched closely. But I do think this exposes the fact that what the two-state solution crowd, who just recite these articles of faith, 67 borders, blah, blah, blah. There's a reason those borders were untenable in 1967. So, going back to them isn't going to actually solve anything. And this exposes that this is not a good faith attempt to resolve a thorny issue, which would be in Israel's best interest to get get this resolved. But it is this kind of.
Well, it depends how it's resolved, because
exactly
the two-state solution just really means dissolve Israel, have a Jewish Arab state, and then have a Jew-free state that'll gobble up the Jewish Israel state.
And that's absolutely it. That has been revealed as not a way to try to get to a good resolution for Israel, but to try to undermine Israel.
Right.
And I think they need to own that.
Well, I mean, it would be interesting to know, do you think that this might be something that the Republicans would want to, use? I know when I wrote my book, The Israeli Solution, which is right behind me, if you guys want to, you can buy it on Amazon, just saying. But I was quoting Newt Gingrich, I think it was, in the Republican debates ahead of the 2012 elections, where he was saying that he didn't support a Palestinian state. and that, why would you do that? And it was really the beginning of move by the Republicans to get away from this paradigm that was so disastrous and so dumb. I mean, it really was the definition of an insanity, as Einstein said, of trying to do the same experiment over and over and expecting different results. And then you had the Trump saying he wanted to get a peace, he wanted to get a deal, he wanted to get the deal of the century, and he was all for one state, two state, whatever you want. But he really did, support Palestinian statehood, as we found out, particularly in some post-presidential interviews that he gave to an anti-Trump Israeli reporter. But you look at that and you wonder, is this something that, would be a Republican policy in a Republican majority Congress that could then, change the way that, in a very major, significant way, that the Republican Party talks about the Palestinians as a counterbalance or whatever, contrast to the Democrats?
I would hope so. And I think, you know, I can't speak for Senator Cruz. I mean, I know his views on this topic. That he is not without sympathy for the many unfortunates who have suffered under Palestinian leadership. But there just is no comparison between the Palestinians and Israel. And you could argue that there really never was one, but certainly over the course of the last 30, 40 years, the enormous value the United States has gotten out of the relationship with Israel, and the negative value that we've gotten out of whatever relationship we've had with the Palestinians. I mean, just sheer self-interest should make this a pretty easy, obvious call. And you can get into the moral case for it if you want, but I don't even think you have to go there. Just look at it in terms of what is in the best interests of the United States. And it that to me is a no-brainer. And so I think it would be a very interesting issue to raise. I think support for Israel is a political winner going into 22 and 24 in the United States. I've seen a lot of polling on it. There have been a lot of hand-wringing over decline for the alliance. I really don't see that in the numbers. And what it needs is forceful defending. And so I think that would be a very interesting conversation to have.
I agree. And I hope that we'll proceed and have that conversation. And in the future, when you come back to the Middle East News Hour, and we'll talk about it maybe a little bit closer to the elections as well, and see where these things are moving. Because it's one of those funny things, which is that you almost get tired. I mean, I am tired of talking about the Palestinians. I mean, I was in the talks with the Palestinians when I was in the army. And since then, just been central in everything that happened, whether it's because we were being blown up in buses, or because we were being pushed around at the UN, or wherever else. But it just never seems to go away, and it's constantly being used as a means to delegitimize the very existence of Israel and to kill a lot of Israelis. So it would be great to think about how we can wrest Israel from the clutches of this Western assault on Israel with the proxies that are the Palestinians. So, and move forward. Victoria, I want to thank you very, very much for joining me today. And it was on such short notice. You guys should know she's a great sport. I asked her and she said, sure, which was amazing, because I've been wanting to have you on the show for quite some time. So I'm glad we were able to do that and make some sense of all of the things that are happening and understand the stakes of the Biden administration's incredibly horrible policies in the Middle East, and hope for the better. So thank you, and we look forward to having you back. I look forward to having you back, and we being the royal we of me, myself, and I. It was great. It was a great pleasure to have you, and privilege.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, and look forward to further debate.
Okay, good. All right, great. So we'll see you guys all next week. And what was I going to say? Oh yeah, we'll see you all next week. And remember to subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it yet, and share this show with everybody that you know, even if they don't like you. Do it anyway, because it's always important. And we'll see you later. Thank you so much.